T, how are ye? Welcome back to the Candlelit Tales podcast, where we tell Irish myths set to original music. My name is Sorcha, and I'm one half of the sibling storytelling duo who founded Candlelit Tales. In this episode, we are continuing our series on the Fianna, with the birth of Diarmuid. Diarmuid was the most beautiful man in the Fianna, and maybe even the world, with a love spot in his forehead and a spear in each hand. And this is the story of how he got here, as told by my brother Aaron. If you'd like to listen to our reflections and join in our monthly chats and support this podcast, you can join our Candlelit crew by following the links in the description below. But for now, Aaron, tell us a story.
It was long ago in Ireland when the Fianna gathered for Imbolg. Fionn had gathered a group of them to celebrate the coming of spring. Although it did not feel warm, the fires were lit, the stories were told, the music was played, and they all gathered to celebrate the light coming back into the land. One of his relatives, Cruithned, a beautiful, dark-eyed, dark-haired, strong woman of the Fianna, was next to Fionn, eyeing all of these men and warriors that came with Fionn McCool to train in the hills of Ireland and defend Ireland from anyone attacking them. So grand and brilliant was his ways with the Fianna that Cruithned asked Fionn, was there anyone among them that was worthy of her love? Fionn smiled a knowing smile. This woman was out looking for sure. But looking around, he saw many that would fail to stand up to her high standards of beauty, of elegance, of strength, and of compassion. But Fionn also knew not to advise in these matters. Instead, knowingly looking up and down, he said, "There's surely one here that you'll find a favour with." And as the evening went on into the dark, the stories that lit up the night lit up the hearts of all who listened, and especially Don, son of Duibhne, who was looking straight at Cruithned, who had taken a little bit more drink than she was used to. And Don, well, he was elegant, he was swift with sword, sweet of speech, and though he quarrelled with many of the Fianna from time to time, his anger was usually put out towards battles and people who deserved it, in his opinion at least. But this particular night, Don managed to sweetly tailor his tune so that she was marching along beside him, and even offering up additions to the melody that they were making. And they made quite the melody that night. As the season went on and the light began to leak into the land, their romance was just beginning. Now Don and Cruithned began to see more and more of each other, but she had heard the stories of his temper and his harshness, and that he had fallen out with Fionn McCool not once, but a few times. And sometimes he wasn't even allowed to come into the feasts the Fianna were having, because he was so well reputed for having a quarrel in him. But she couldn't help it. As the summer came on and the brightness of the months began to heat the land fully, they began to fall deeply in love with one another. And it was no one's surprise that they saw an awful lot of each other, and by the time the fires of Beowthna were roaring, they were hand in hand. As the summer went on and everyone went all over Ireland, from hills to valleys to coasts to flatlands, they travelled together the way any lovers would. And so when the gathering at Lunasa, when those offered to marry for a year with a hand-fasting ritual were given the choice to do so, Cruithned and Don stepped into the fore. She was aware that something might be changing inside of her as well. As she placed her hand on her belly, they fastened their hands together, and 3 months later she knew her belly was indeed growing. But the darkness was coming into the land as autumn leaves began to fall from the trees, and the next great Celtic festival was approaching. Samhain, the beginning of the dark half of the year. And as the darkness approached, well, the love and the lightness of their relationship seemed to dwindle and fall brown down like the leaves from the trees. And suddenly there was disharmony between them. They were irksome around each other. Don's temper rose as the winds gathered speed, and as his cloak began to be pulled over his shoulders, he tightened his heart, and his emotions seemed to be closed off from the one woman who wanted to see more of inside of him than anything else. And as he turned from her, she gave him nothing but a cold, temperate glare. And so he would return to their modest housing and only be welcomed with coldness, bitterness, and harsh words. His words were harsher, and so which one was to blame no one could really tell. But it was easy to see that their harmony was over and done. And so they wintered coldly together. But by the next spring it was no surprise for Fionn McCool to see that Cruithnid was no longer with Don. Instead, she had a bundle and a baby in her arms. There was no sign of Don, he noticed. He wasn't surprised by that. He was even more relieved he hadn't given her any advice, for she wouldn't have listened to him anyway, and he would have gotten the blame if he did. He would, however, help her out if she needed it, and she did ask his advice. She was now raising this child on her own. Don would see the boy from time to time if need be, and they had agreed they would not be remarrying and staying together when the hand fasting came around in Lunasa. They didn't even last the year. But they didn't need to. They left things on respectful terms, and it was agreed between them that they would find people to raise their boy. Diarmuid was his name. This boy would be raised by the Fianna. He would enter into the Fianna. Fionn McCool himself would oversee who would foster the boy. And any one born in high standings would be fostered off to great many numbers. So they were curious as to who Fionn McCool would choose to foster this boy. And he was beautiful, young Diarmuid. Just a baby. Still, Fionn doted on him when he was given the opportunity to. As weeks turned into months, and as the summer came once more, as Lunasa ran through and the bounds that tied Cruithnid and Don were cast aside for sure, it began to dawn on Cruithnid that she would have to do something unusual to appease her sense of adventure. She'd just given birth, but she didn't want to be confined to being a carer for the rest of her days. She saw some women and how that turned for them. Her sense of adventure and glee and stories were not over just because she was a mother now, although she seemed to be getting pegged with that. So she was now curious as to see who would foster her son, and when she asked Fionn McCool who it would be, she was very relieved to hear him say he would ask Angus Og. Angus, the god of love, the brilliant one of the Tuatha in the other world. And so she followed Fionn all the way up and east to Brún na Báine, which was his home. This beautiful hill nestled into the hill's sides, with the sweeping river, the river Boyne, that the goddess Boann had carved in her trace running away from the well of wisdom so long ago. The mother of Angus had left this brilliant duty upon him to bring the sacred dead across through the veil and serve when times were right to do so for the mortals living in Ireland, for they would lose their way and not always think of love. But Angus was the god of love in some ways, in so many ways he loved to bring love about. And so when he saw Fionn McCool bringing a beautiful woman and a gorgeous child into his own home, he greeted them warmly and affectionately and had a brilliant feast laid out. And all of his men and minstrels, poets and musicians came out then. And among them was a steward named Rock, who was calm and silent and polite and offered drinks of mead and honeyed wine and beautiful choice meats to Fionn, to Angus, and to Cruthned. She took anything he offered her and smiled politely, meeting his gaze and noticing a fire dance between them, something she had not noticed for quite a while now. The time seemed long since she had felt that tug and that yearn and that long lost sense of longing. But there it was between them, and Fionn noticed it too. And no harm could come from this. After all, they were nestled in and around the brew. So the following day, when Fionn McCool was to go back, he looked at Cruthned and asked if she would like to stay, knowing the answer before she even smiled. And so it was that Angus Og agreed to foster this baby boy Diarmuid, and also that Cruthned would stay with them for a while, listening to Rock telling her enchanting stories and poems and songs, and no doubt they spent a lot of time together, doing many other things besides talking. The time went on, and Diarmuid grew, and as he grew, Cruthned's belly grew too. He began to walk and speak words as she gave birth to another baby boy, Rock's son. They called him Enda. The steward was delighted to see that Diarmuid was looking after this baby boy as soon as he was born. And as he was now beginning to walk and talk himself, Angus was taking more pleasure in talking to him, teaching him by letting him find his way. This was part of how Angus liked to let love linger between him and any children he fostered, leave them teach themselves with full attention, full compassion, full love in all that he would give to them, but not to teach and preach and tell, because children just didn't really listen, in his experience at least. And so things went on fairly well at the brew for a while. Cruthned was delighted to be surrounded by otherworldly magic. The stories they would tell, the music that they could brilliantly play would sweep her imagination away. With enchantments and magic next to her, she found herself in the stories that were being spoken. She could see more and through the veil than ever before. The magic of this time was so brilliant and so otherworldly, I couldn't dare recount it. But I'm sure Cruthned had such brilliant memories, it could only last in a tale that you could meet if you were asleep and dreaming of that otherworldly liminal space. And so, she spent many moons in the other world. But a conversation had to be had, as Rock was curious to see would his own son be as welcomed into the Fianna as her first son, Diarmuid. You see, Diarmuid was being fostered here for a time, yes, under the supervision of himself, the steward of Angus, and of course his own mother was very close besides. But Diarmuid would be welcomed back to the Fianna, no doubt, because of the bloodline that brought him straight to Fionn McCool, and of course Don, his father, was part of the Fianna. But would Rock's son be as welcomed, he thought? He had a worry over him. There was tension sometimes between the other crowd and the mortal folk, although you wouldn't know it to meet Cruthned. She was so enchanted with everything and loved so much to be in the other realm that she seemed to blend in perfectly. But there was tension, and some people didn't like or trust the other crowd. And he wondered if his son Enda would be as well treated by the rest of the Fianna as he was being treated by his brother Diarmuid. The two were inseparable. Ever since Rock's son Enda had been born, Diarmuid took a vast fascination to him. He was curious, but not in a poking his eyes out sort of a way. He was cautious and always careful with his younger brother. Under strict instruction from Angus Og, he would carefully help him and teach him what he was learning. And so he had to learn everything himself and pass it on to his younger brother. And of course, Rock's son Enda was fascinated with his older brother. Diarmuid, who was so agile and quick and clever and keen, he was able to do things and reach higher and taller and louder. His voice brilliant, his hands strong. Everything he could do was simply out of reach for young Enda. But Enda tried, as he would every single time. He'd almost certainly fail, but Diarmuid would help, pick him up, he'd laugh, he'd gesture, and then they'd try again. And whether it was running, or whether it was sword fighting with sticks, or whether it was leaping, jumping, or tossing and throwing, well, Enda was always a little bit behind. But he was the younger brother of a capricious young boy. And Diarmuid was excellent at most of the things he tried to do, even if it was just the first time he was doing it. But with all of this, the conversation came back to one Rock had had a number of times with his beautiful, strong-willed and powerful partner, Cruthed, who would foster young Enda in the Fianna, who would teach him the mortal ways and help him train for the feats and tests of the Fianna. To pass them, of course. They went up outside the Brún na Báine, and they looked across the sky, dotted with clouds, the blue poking through in between, and a huge murder of crows flew by, darkening as if moving in a whole cloud together. They landed on the trees, lightly, swaying the branches below them and bending the boughs down below. Early morning light springing up through and across from the east. And as the light lingered across the faces, Rock and Cruthed, Diarmuid and his brother Enda, Rock set off to find the Fianna.